Well, I'm very pleased to welcome to the program now Mark Lowcock, who's the UN's humanitarian chief. He is live from the United Nations in New York. Thank you very much for joining us on Al Jazeera, sir. A pretty dire situation with more than 80% of Yemenis now lacking food, fuel, water, and access to health care. Can you tell us first where things stand as far as the humanitarian response plan for Yemen?
Well, those people who your viewers have just seen in your report are just some of the nearly 20 million Yemenis who are in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. In the UN, we've prepared a plan for 2018 to reach many millions of those people, and we need $2.5 billion during the course of the year to do that. I am today announcing the largest ever allocation we have made from the UN's Central Emergency Response Fund, an allocation of $50 million to get the aid operation pump primed for 2018. And the fact that I'm having to do that obviously is not a success measure. That is a sign of exactly how desperate the situation is. Right. The situation in Yemen today, right now, to the population of the country looks like the apocalypse. And unless the situation changes, we're going to have the world's worst humanitarian disaster for 50 years. A
large allocation of funds, you say, sir, but what good is all that money when UN agencies don't have full humanitarian access to some of the hardest hit communities in Yemen?
So 3 things need to happen if we're to avoid this terrible tragedy. Firstly, there does need to be a scaling back of the military activity. There's been a big intensification of the bombing and the fighting and the shelling. We in the UN have identified 580 airstrikes, bombs dropped from the air in the course of December. That's twice the number that we identified in November. Of course, all that follows the atrocious missile attacks, which your report picked up as well, from Yemen into Saudi Arabia. So the fighting needs to be scaled back. Secondly, we need to keep the ports open. Access, as you imply, is a key issue, and from early November to late December, the key ports on the Red Sea were basically closed. They have been reopened. Yemen imports almost all of its food and fuel and medicines. Those ports need to be kept open. And then thirdly, we do need more money for the aid operation. The UN, in the second half of 2017, with its partners, was able to reach 7 million people with food and millions more with water and health supplies. So we're able to make a big difference if those 3 things happen.
It's not just hunger and famine, is it? We're now hearing also of outbreaks of more diseases in Yemen, like diphtheria, in addition to cholera. Can the aid agencies cope with these additional crises? Can they bring in the help they need for those kinds of situations?
Well, we need to scale up our response. The cholera outbreak is probably the worst the world has ever seen, with 1 million suspected cases up to the end of 2017. This terrible new epidemic of diphtheria, a bacterial disease which should be completely preventable by immunization, has already affected up to 500 people, with dozens and dozens of deaths in the last few weeks. That is going to spread like wildfire unless we can scale up the immunization program and sustain the health services. And the things I've talked about, the things that need to happen for that to be possible.
Mr. Lowcock, I want to ask you now a more political question. Norway announced this week that it would stop supplying weapons to the United Arab Emirates because of what it called grave concern over the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. But the US and Britain continue to supply the Saudis with billions of dollars worth of weapons. The US also provides logistical military support to Saudi Arabia. And there are many people who say they are, in a way, complicit in this crisis in Yemen. Why isn't there more pressure on them from the United Nations, from the Security Council, given this situation that you've described yourself? Shouldn't they be doing more at the Security Council level?
Well, I think it's a very fair question to ask why the Security Council hasn't engaged on the Yemen crisis in the way it has recently, for example, on Syria. Last month on Syria, the Security Council came together to agree an extension of a major aid operation to reach millions of people inside Syria. And it hasn't been able to do the same thing in Yemen. And I think you need to ask that question to the members of the Security Council, the member states
what
there
action
who are,
would you
who are
like the Security Council
for,
to be taking?
Deciding what to do.
What action precisely would you, as the humanitarian envoy, would like the Security Council to take?
Well, I set out a 5-point plan to the Security Council at the beginning of November, particularly to deal with the blockade that was put in place at that time. So I would like the ports to be kept open. I would like the military activity to be scaled back. I would like all of the parties to this conflict on all sides to fulfill the responsibilities they have to uphold international humanitarian law, to protect civilians, and to remember that even wars have laws, and everybody, the parties to the conflict themselves and those outside with an influence on them, has a responsibility to do that.
Mark Lowcock, thank you so very much for speaking to us. Mark Lowcock is the UN Humanitarian Affairs Chief, joining us there from New York at the United Nations. Thank you so much.